For more than 5 decades, counselors trained at Richmont have served their clients well by integrating faith with clinical expertise. The impact Richmont's had in the field of psychology is largely derived from a visionary group of men and women that saw a glaring need in the field of counseling and counseling interventions, and that was to address the spiritual components of therapy and clinical intervention in a way that had never been done before. As we celebrate 50 years of integrated counseling, I now invite you to listen to some of the counselors and some of the people that created the vision and made it happen in helping us achieve our mission of restoration, healing, and transformation.
I first came onto the faculty here when it was the Psychological Studies Institute in 1987. And at that time, there were still a number of the founders who were involved in PSI, as we called it then. So I got to talk with several of them. Some were still teaching at the time. And their motivation, as I understand it, in talking with some of the original founders, they were a group of psychologists who had practices here in Atlanta. One was a faculty member at Georgia State University. And they began to ponder what were the implications of their Christian faith for their counseling practices. So they formed a little study group, which they named the Religious Consultation and Research Society. Rather cumbersome name. That was the original name of Richmont. It goes back to that era. So their motivation was primarily to see what were the implications, what was the rationale for them to bring their faith in contact with their clinical practices. And out of that beginning grew the Psychological Studies Institute.
When I think of my history with Richmont, it really goes way back to the very roots. And I think of God actually conceiving what later was PSI, but much earlier was called RCRS. And that was in 1973. I came as a student in 1976 to RCRS. I was looking for a place that would teach me how to be helpful to people, honor God, and hold high respectability in both the Christian and the secular world.
Well, I came to Atlanta to teach at Georgia State University, but really my reason was for the Religious Research and Consultation Society, which was the Psychological Studies Institute, which is Richmont. And so I had taught classes and was involved with the clinical program until one day the board chairman called me and said, would you be willing to consider being president of the Psychological Studies Institute? And I said I would think about it, pray about it, and they said, we're having a board meeting tomorrow night, let me know in the morning. And so I called the chairman in the morning and said, yes, I'll be the president, went to the first meeting. And in that meeting, there was a new board member who was a business person from Atlanta, and they passed out the financial information. And after the discussion of that, he summarized it by saying, there's no business reason why this organization should exist. So it's got to be here by the grace of God.
Well, from its inception, PSI was, the basic mission of PSI, as I understand it, was to provide competent and compassionate care to people in the church and in the community at large. And so from the very beginning, pretty much, I know from the time I was in the program, there were the PSI counseling centers, as I said, that served as practicum sites. So we worked in those centers, which were based in churches.
In the early years, We were tied with Georgia State, and I saw God be the midwife that took us out of Georgia State and birthed us as this new little thing called PSI, the Psychological Studies Institute. And the reason I say he birthed us, there were a lot of labor pains getting us out of Georgia State.
So when I became president, that my first and foremost thing was survival. That we had virtually no students, we had no money, and we had no campus. And the United Baptist Church allowed us to move into their facilities on Metropolitan Avenue, so that got us a campus. We had 12 students in the entering body, and we had also gotten a grant from the Morris Foundation, which gave us some money to survive on for the next 3 years. In the next 3 years that we were able to get so that we were operating on an even budget, we had greatly expanded the number of students, and that shortly after I left the presidency, we moved to the McCarthy building at the Mount Perrin Church of God. So we were in a much more desirable set of place.
But God birthed us out of Georgia State, and then we were baby in that we didn't have anything to eat. We didn't have a home. We didn't have money. We were pretty desperate. And in those early years, 76 into the early 80s, we bounced around. We had 5 different homes. Usually they were in the downtown Peachtree area, but they were typically in the seedy area. So whereas students today come to a very nice location, we would step over the drunks in order to get into the building, which then locked and made us say. Or we would step over the drug paraphernalia that was left there by the homeless. That was some of the variety of homeless years our institution had. And then we got promoted to Stewart Avenue, which is not the best, but that was good for us. And so we stayed at Stewart Avenue quite a few years. But the organization, the institution, God had birthed us at Georgia State through Dr. Donaldson, and then he launched us as this fledgling baby without resources, but he had amazing leaders, some of whom were the presidents, some of whom were the professors. A key one, Dr. Major, was a key person for establishing. And then in time, he took this baby PSI and grew it into gaining accreditation.
Yeah, from 1998 to 2000, 2 of the most difficult years of my life when I was president of PSI at the time, my core mission was to not let any checks bounce. It was a rough time. I go back with PSI Richmont before 1998. In fact, 15 years before. I came here because I was recruited by Don Altman, longtime friend of Paul Walker. And Don and I became very good friends. And after about 5 years, Don left to take another job and asked me if I wanted to be president. I had no desire to be president, but I started thinking, if I don't take this job, I may not have a job, so I think I will for a while. Anyway, 1998, 6 months in, I'm talking to a student, and the student says, "Isn't it a shame that PSI is closing?" I said, "Well, that is news to me." And he said, "Well, no, I just came from Georgia State. It was announced by the dean of the school. They're ending their relationship with PSI." That was not a good day. So I called Don and said, "How did you trick me into taking this difficult job?" And he said, "Don't worry, there's a document where the dean signed saying that no students would ever be harmed by any abrupt closures. Anybody in the program would be able to graduate." So I went and told the dean that, and the dean said, "No, I don't intend to honor that." We talked to a lawyer. The lawyer said, you guys probably can't afford for me to help you, but I have a friend at Georgia State. He's a provost, and he's a Christian. Why don't you see if he can be helpful? I talked to the provost. He was wonderful, and he required that the dean enforce that 2-year thing that said we cannot abruptly end the relationship. So we had 2 years to become a standalone graduate school with the goal of all the checks cash and no one graduates from an unaccredited school. And somehow, and I sort of know how, there's a lot of heroes there, including Henry Henniger and many others, the Terrells, it happened.
In 2000, our relationship with Georgia State went south, so we looked for a partner. PSI did, and then Chattanooga Bible Institute in Chattanooga had the resources and the funding and the endowment. We had the need for a partner with someone like that, those resources, and so it was a great marriage in the sense that Chattanooga Bible Institute was still faithful to its mission of emphasizing the Bible, and PSI was able to get funding for the integration connected with the counselor education program. So it was a nice combination there.
Yeah, the relationship between CBI and PSI goes back before 1998, at least 2 or 3 years before. I got to know Henry Henniger. Henry and Tim Sizemore came down. I think CBI is fantastic. Their mission I was intrigued with, to sort of be like a Moody Bible Institute for Chattanooga and beyond. And they got into counseling, and I think it was almost accidentally grew a large counseling center, maybe 20 therapists by that time. And they wanted to explore education, and they got into it a little bit and realized what we realized, this is a big deal to become a standalone graduate school. So that was, there was some conversations around that, but nothing had come of them. But when we were faced with needing to do something immediately, those conversations struck back up. And in fairness, some wonderful things happened. In 2 years, we did become a standalone graduate school, and we went from 50 students total, because Georgia State only allowed 25 a year, and one full-time person, Don, a few part-time people, and a lot of adjuncts. And I've often joked, and the endowment was whatever coins were jiggling in my pocket, to, like in 5 years, there are maybe pushing 250 students, more than 200, I think it was getting close to 250, 50 or 60 full-time employees. It was remarkable. Henry as Henniger and CBI are more responsible for that than anyone. It would have never happened without the financial support of CBI, and Henry's just who he is as a person. And there were also some godsend folks along the way that it wouldn't have happened without the Terrells. They came in at the right time and just were the kind of the mom and dad to the students, and everybody knew I didn't want to be the president, so I tricked Henry for a while, and then finally Jeff to be the president for a while. But that relationship was huge.
Henry Henniger, who used to be one of the early presidents of Richmont, or PSI back then, before Gary Moon, he referred to the providence, parade of providence of God, that God went before, because before we had the marriage between PSI and CBI, PSI would be in different churches in the Atlanta area, and many times financially there were struggles because it wasn't a real organized, it was an organization, but there wasn't a home for it until in the history, Mount Perrin Church was able to provide the McCartney building. But before that, we were just sort of like nomads going to different churches and having classes, and it's like, but God was always faithful. He was always faithful to provide for us, and that parade of providence is, I think, the most outstanding thing, I think, in the history of PSI and Richmont, that God has always been there for our needs at every point, and He's provided for us.
Part of what God has provided at Richmont is students. He has called students here from all over the United States, in fact, all over the world, and that students have come here at great personal cost in terms of dollars, in terms of time, and have been faithful. We've had a very good retention rate, This is not a situation where the faculty or the board of directors have done something to build the school. It's been the family of Richmont that has, the board has its role, the faculty has its role, but the students are really why we're here, and the students have also had the role in building the school.
So my hopes for Richmont are that what I see going well continues to be even better, because God primes and God just brings flourishing beyond what we expect. And when I think back to 1973 and about to be 2023, PSI has only survived because God has a hand on that initial conception, and He's got a hand on the vision. I don't know what all that vision is yet, and I may never get to see it all, but it's bigger than we can imagine. And I just want Richmont to grab for it and grow for it.
Competence, compassion, care. Those are the hallmarks of each Richmont graduate who enters the profession. So as you can see, 50 years after the founding of the Psychological Studies Institute, we continue to celebrate and honor those who saw a need and met it with compassion, care, and a desire to serve others in the most profound way.